My name is Daniel Reyes, and for 11 years I have owned 22 acres of quiet, wooded land at the edge of a town most people have never heard of. I bought that land before there was a subdivision anywhere near it. Back then, the closest thing to a neighbor was a cattle fence a half-mile down the road and a family of deer that treated my property like their personal buffet. I loved it that way. I built a small cabin, planted a garden, and spent my weekends doing absolutely nothing that resembled city life. That was the whole point. Then, about 4 years ago, a developer bought the 300 acres next to mine and turned it into Fox Hollow Estates, a planned community with a homeowners association, matching mailboxes, and a welcome sign with a little painted fox on it. I didn't think much of it. New neighbors aren't the end of the world, and honestly, I figured a development might even raise my property value someday. What I did not expect, what I never in 1,000 years could have predicted, was that the HOA overseeing the development would eventually try to run a public street straight through the edge of my land without asking me, without surveying properly, and without the faintest idea that I had documentation going back to the original 1962 land grant that would blow their entire plan out of the water. This is the story of how a homeowners association tried to quietly annex a strip of my property to connect their new street, how they underestimated a guy who happens to keep really good paperwork, and how it all came crashing down in a county records office in front of witnesses. Chapter 1. The first sign something was wrong. It started with orange flags. Little plastic surveyor's flags, the kind you see stuck in the ground before construction crews show up. I noticed them on a Saturday morning while walking my dog along the eastern edge of my property, the side that borders Fox Hollow Estates. There were maybe 15 of them, staked in a neat line that curved from the new subdivision's half-finished road directly across what I was fairly certain was my land. I didn't panic. Surveyors make mistakes, contractors get their lot lines mixed up, and sometimes a flag or two ends up on the wrong side of a fence. I took photos, noted the date, and figured I'd mention it to whoever was in charge if the flags were still there in a week. They were still there in a week. In fact, there were more of them, and now there was also a small handwritten sign zip tied to a stake that read Future Extension, Meadowbrook Lane. Meadowbrook Lane, as it turned out, was the name of the new street Fox Hollow Estates was building to connect their second phase of homes to the main road. The problem was that the flags weren't just near my property. They were on it. Deep on it. Enough that if that street got built along that line, it would cut off nearly 2 acres of my land and put a paved road within 30 feet of my cabin. I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the HOA office. Chapter 2. It's just a formality. The woman who answered the phone at the Fox Hollow Estates HOA office introduced herself as Denise, and she had the practiced, sugary patience of someone who fields complaints all day long. I explained the situation as calmly as I could. I told her I had flags on my property marking what appeared to be a road extension, and I wanted to know what was going on. "Oh, that's just for Meadowbrook Lane," she said, like I should already know exactly what that meant. "It's part of Phase 2. We are connecting the new section to the county road." "Right," I said, "but the flags are on my land. Not the subdivision's land." There was a pause, the kind of pause that tells you the person on the other end has no idea what to say next but doesn't want to admit it. "I'll have to check with our board and our engineering firm," she said. "But I'm sure it's just a formality. Sometimes the survey stakes extend a little past the construction zone for reference points." That word, formality, would come back to haunt her. A week later I got a letter in the mail, not from Denise, not from an engineer, but from the HOA's legal counsel, a firm called Ashford and Vance. The letter was polite on its surface but unmistakable underneath. It informed me that Fox Hollow Estates HOA had determined that a small portion of the eastern boundary of my property may fall within a historic access easement originally intended for agricultural use, and that the HOA board had voted to proceed with construction of Meadowbrook Lane along the surveyed route, citing this easement as their legal basis. The letter closed by saying that if I had concerns, I was welcome to attend the next board meeting, but that construction would begin in 6 weeks regardless. 6 weeks. They gave me 6 weeks to accept that they were going to build a public street across my property because of an easement I had never heard of, never signed, and never seen documented anywhere. I want to be honest with you. My first reaction was anger. I read that letter 3 times standing in my own driveway, and each time the word formality seemed to get bigger on the page. My second reaction, thankfully, came about an hour later, once the anger had cooled enough for me to think clearly. I sat down at my kitchen table, made a pot of coffee I didn't end up drinking, and made a decision that would shape everything that followed. I was not going to react emotionally. I was going to react with documentation. If they wanted to talk about legal easements, I was going to make absolutely sure I understood, better than they did, exactly what did and did not exist on that property. So I went to pull every piece of paperwork I had ever been given when I bought that land. Chapter 3. The land grant nobody remembered. When I purchased my 22 acres 11 years earlier, the seller was an elderly man named Walter Higgins, whose family had owned that land since the early 60s. Walter was meticulous, almost obsessively so, and when we closed on the property, he didn't just hand me a folder of standard documents. He handed me a genuine archive. Original deeds. Tax records going back decades. A hand-annotated plat map from the county surveyor's office dated 1962, the year his father first registered the parcel. And, most importantly, a formal boundary survey conducted in 1998 when Walter subdivided a small portion of the land to sell to a cousin, a survey that clearly and precisely marked every corner of what would eventually become my 22 acres. I still had every single one of those documents in a fireproof filing box in my closet, because Walter had told me, almost like a warning, keep these. People forget where lines are, and paper is the only thing that remembers. At the time, I remember thinking he was being a little dramatic. He was in his late 70s when we closed on the sale, and he had the manner of a man who had seen enough disputes over fences and property corners in his life to trust nothing except ink on paper. Standing in his kitchen that day, watching him hand me box after box of records, I nodded politely and told him I'd take good care of them. I never imagined I would one day be pulling that box out at 10 o'clock at night, spreading yellowed pages across my dining table, grateful beyond words that he had been so particular. I remember calling Walter's daughter, who still lived about 40 minutes away, just to let her know what was happening. She wasn't surprised in the slightest. She told me her father used to say that half the disputes in the county could be solved in an afternoon if people would just walk down to the recorder's office instead of arguing on their porches. That phone call gave me a strange kind of confidence. It reminded me that I wasn't just fighting for a strip of dirt. I was standing on the same ground Walter's family had defended once before, using the very same tools he had left behind for exactly this purpose. I spent an entire weekend going through them with a cup of coffee and a notepad. The 1998 survey was the key. It showed, in exact measurements tied to permanent monuments still visible in the ground today, that the eastern boundary of my property extended a full 60 feet further than the line Fox Hollow Estates engineers were using for their proposed road. There was no historic agricultural easement anywhere in the chain of title. I checked the original 1962 grant, I checked every deed transfer since, and I checked the county's own recorded plat books. Nothing. No easement, no right-of-way. Nothing granting anyone permission to build a road across that land. What I did find, buried in the appendix of the 1998 survey, was something even better. A note from a surveyor referencing a boundary dispute between Walter's father and a neighboring rancher back in 1971, a dispute that had gone to the county for resolution and resulted in an official corrected boundary determination that had been filed and recorded. That determination had, decades ago, resolved any ambiguity about where that eastern line actually sat, and it sat exactly where Walter's fences and my current property lines were. I sat back in my chair when I found that reference and just stared at it for a while. It's a strange feeling, realizing that a stranger's argument from half a century ago, a dispute I had never heard of between two men I never met, was about to become the single most important piece of evidence in a fight I hadn't asked for. I drove to the county archives the next morning and requested the original 1971 file. It took the clerk almost 20 minutes to locate it in a back storage room, but when she finally brought it out, it was exactly as the survey notes had described. A short, formal determination, signed by the county surveyor of the time, laying out the corrected boundary in plain, unambiguous language, with a hand-drawn diagram attached showing the exact same corner posts that still marked my property today. In other words, the HOA's engineers hadn't just made a mistake. They had built their entire proposed road on a boundary line that had already been legally settled 50 years earlier and was sitting in the public record the whole time, available to anyone willing to spend 20 minutes asking a records clerk for a folder. Someone simply hadn't bothered to look. Chapter 4. Doing it right. I could have gone in swinging. I could have shown up to their next board meeting with a folder of papers and started shouting about lawsuits. But I've learned that when you have the facts on your side, the smartest thing you can do is stay calm, be thorough, and let the paperwork speak louder than your voice ever could. So instead, I did three things. First, I hired an independent, licensed land surveyor, someone with no connection to the HOA or their development company, to conduct a fresh boundary survey using the 1962 grant, the 1998 survey, and the 1971 boundary determination as reference points. I wanted a brand new, current dated document that confirmed everything the old paperwork already told me. It took about 3 weeks, and when it came back, it matched my old records almost to the inch. My eastern boundary was exactly where I believed it was, and Fox Hollow Estates' proposed road was sitting roughly 55 feet inside my land at its deepest point. Second, I went to the county recorder's office and pulled certified copies of every relevant document. The original 1962 grant, the 1971 boundary resolution, the 1998 survey, and, for good measure, I requested the recorded plat maps for Fox Hollow Estates itself, the ones the developer had filed when they first got approval for their subdivision. This turned out to be one of the smartest moves I made, because those very plat maps, the ones the HOA's own developer had filed with the county years earlier, showed the subdivision's boundary stopping well short of my property line. In other words, their own official records agreed with mine. The only place the boundary was wrong was in whatever internal document their construction engineers were currently using. Third, I wrote a formal letter, not an angry one, but a clear and factual one, to the HOA board, copying their attorney at Ashford and Vance. I laid out the entire history. The 1962 grant, the 1971 resolution, the 1998 survey, my new independent survey, and their own recorded subdivision plat, which contradicted the boundary their construction team was using. I attached copies of every document. I requested that construction on Meadowbrook Lane be halted immediately pending a joint review of the boundary, and I noted, politely but firmly, that continuing construction on private property without an established legal easement could expose both the HOA and its contractors to significant liability. Writing that letter took me longer than I expected. I went through 4 drafts. The first one was too angry, full of phrases I knew wouldn't help me once lawyers got involved. The second one was too timid, hedging every statement as though I wasn't sure of my own facts. By the third and fourth drafts, I had found the tone I wanted, direct, unemotional, and entirely built around verifiable dates and document numbers rather than opinions. I read it out loud to myself before sending it, imagining how it would sound if it were ever read aloud in front of a judge, because I wanted every sentence to hold up under that kind of scrutiny. Then I mailed it certified, so there would be no question about when it was received. I also sent a duplicate copy directly to the county planning department, not as a formal complaint, but simply as a courtesy notification that a boundary discrepancy had been identified on a road project currently under construction near their jurisdiction. I didn't know at the time how significant that small extra step would turn out to be. Chapter 5. The Board Meeting. 2 weeks later, I got an invitation to attend a special session of the Fox Hollow Estates HOA Board meeting. I suspect they weren't thrilled to have me there, but my letter had clearly rattled something loose, because when I walked into that meeting room, there were more people present than I expected. The 5 board members, their attorney, a representative from the development company, and, notably, a county planning official who I hadn't invited but was apparently interested in the outcome given what my letter had implied about improper construction on private land. I brought a single binder. Inside were labeled copies of every document, organized chronologically, with the key boundary lines highlighted on each map so anyone in the room could follow along without a law degree. The HOA's attorney opened by trying to reassert their earlier position, that a historic easement existed. I asked him, calmly, if he could point to where that easement was recorded. He shuffled some papers. He said his firm was still confirming the exact documentation. I told him I understood, because I had already checked, and there wasn't any documentation to confirm, because it didn't exist. Then I opened my binder. I walked the room through the 1962 grant first, showing the original boundary as drawn by the county surveyor at the time. Then the 1971 resolution, which showed that any prior ambiguity about that exact line had already been settled by the county decades ago, with Walter's family's boundary upheld. Then the 1998 survey, showing the same line, confirmed independently by a licensed surveyor working for the previous owner. Then my own fresh survey from just weeks earlier, showing, again, the same line. 4 separate documents, spanning 60 years, all agreeing with each other down to a matter of inches. And then I placed the 5th document on the table. Their own recorded subdivision plat map, filed by their own developer, years before any of this started, which showed the boundary of Fox Hollow Estates stopping well short of my land, in agreement with everything else I had just shown them. The room got very quiet. One of the board members, A soft-spoken man named Harold, who had been mostly nodding along with the attorney up to that point, leaned forward and asked if he could hold the developer's own plat map for a moment. He studied it for what felt like a full minute, comparing it silently against the highlighted line on my independent survey, before setting it down and saying, quietly, to no one in particular, "This is our own filing. We filed this." Nobody responded right away. The development representative shifted in his seat and mumbled something about needing to check with the engineering team before commenting further, but the damage, if you could call the truth damage, was already done. There was no version of the conversation left where the easement claim could survive 5 documents pointing the same direction. The county planning official, who had been mostly silent up to that point, finally spoke up. She said that based on what she was seeing, it appeared the construction crew for Meadowbrook Lane may have been working from an outdated or incorrect internal site plan that did not match the officially recorded boundary, and that continuing construction under those circumstances could indeed create a serious legal problem, both for the HOA and for the county's own permitting records, since Meadowbrook Lane's route had presumably been approved based on a boundary that didn't match what was actually recorded. The HOA's attorney asked for a recess. Chapter 6. The Fallout. What followed over the next month was less dramatic than the board meeting itself, but no less satisfying. Construction on Meadowbrook Lane stopped immediately, not because I demanded it, but because the county planning department flagged the discrepancy and would not allow work to continue until the boundary issue was formally resolved. The HOA's engineering firm, the one that had staked those original flags on my land, was brought in to explain their process, and it came out that they had relied on an old, unofficial hand-drawn sketch from the developer's early planning phase rather than pulling the actual recorded survey documents. It was, in the kindest possible interpretation, a shortcut that should never have been taken. In a less kind interpretation, it was laziness that nearly cost me 2 acres of my own land. The HOA board, to their credit once the facts were undeniable, did not try to fight it further. Their attorney reached out to me directly and proposed a redesigned route for Meadowbrook Lane, one that curved along the actual recorded boundary rather than cutting across my property. It added a modest cost to their construction budget and required a small adjustment to a handful of lots in Phase 2, but it kept the road entirely on their own land, exactly where it belonged. I want to be fair here. Once the truth came out, the HOA didn't try to bully me or drag things through years of litigation. They corrected course. The board even sent a formal written apology, acknowledging that the construction stakes had encroached on my property without authorization and that the claimed easement had no basis in the recorded chain of title. Denise, the woman I first spoke to on the phone, called me a few weeks later, this time not to reassure me it was just a formality, but to let me know the new route had been approved by the county and construction was resuming, safely on their side of the line. The engineering firm responsible for the original stakes ended up losing that contract before Phase 2 was finished. I heard secondhand, through one of the Fox Hollow Estates residents who had started chatting with me over the fence line during the whole ordeal, that the HOA board had grown tired of explaining to homeowners why a road that was supposed to be finished months earlier was suddenly being rerouted. Word travels fast in a small community, and by the time construction resumed, most of the neighborhood knew the general shape of what had happened, even if they didn't know every detail. A few residents actually stopped by my property line to introduce themselves properly for the first time, half out of curiosity and half, I think, out of genuine appreciation that someone had caught the mistake before it became permanent concrete and asphalt running through a stranger's backyard. There was also a quieter consequence that I only learned about months later. The county planning department, prompted by the discrepancy on my property, decided to conduct a broader review of the boundary documentation used throughout the rest of the Fox Hollow Estates project. As far as I know, no other major errors were found, but the review reportedly tightened the county's own requirements for how developers had to verify recorded boundaries before staking any new construction going forward. It was a small, unglamorous kind of victory, the sort that doesn't come with fireworks, but it meant that some future landowner, somewhere else in the county, might never have to go through what I went through, simply because a records clerk now double-checked a box that used to get skipped. Chapter 7. What I Learned. I think about this whole ordeal sometimes when I'm out walking that eastern edge of my property, the one that almost had a paved road running through it. It's easy, especially with something as dry as boundary lines and survey documents, to assume none of it matters until the day it suddenly does. Walter Higgins knew that. He told me to keep those papers because people forget where lines are, but paper doesn't forget. He was right in a way I couldn't have fully appreciated until an HOA tried to build a street through my backyard based on an easement that never existed. There's a broader lesson in here too, one that goes beyond property lines. Institutions, whether it's a homeowners association, a developer, or any organization with a bit of authority behind it, can sometimes move forward on assumptions rather than facts, especially when they think no one on the other side is paying close enough attention to push back. The word formality gets used a lot in those situations, as a way of smoothing over something that hasn't actually been verified. It's a word worth being suspicious of. If there's a takeaway from all of this, it's simple. Keep your documents. Meadowbrook Lane exists today, curving gently along the correct boundary, a good 55 feet from where it almost Saturday. My 2 acres are still mine. My cabin still sits in the quiet I bought it for. And every so often, when I see a new homeowner from Fox Hollow Estates walking the perimeter trail that now runs along our shared boundary, I think about how close that boundary came to disappearing entirely, and how a handful of old documents, kept safe by a man who understood their worth, ended up being the thing that stopped it. Sometimes the strongest thing you can bring to a fight isn't a raised voice or a threat. It's a folder of the right paperwork, organized, dated, and undeniable, placed calmly on a table in front of the people who assumed you'd never have it. And that, in the end, is exactly what happened here.